e4 by Duda, e5 by Magnus. Very solid. We have the Ruy Lopez on the board. a6 played here by Magnus Carlsen, and now bishop goes back. Knight comes out, white castles. Bishop e7. We are in the main line theory of the Ruy Lopez. Is there going to be a marshal? Well, turns out Duda plays a4, the anti-marshal system, and then breaks in the center with d4. This is all well-known theory. And now Jan takes on e5, pawn takes, and now you put your knight on d2. This is generally how you play. You avoid the queen trade. Magnus puts his bishop on c5. Now the c4 square is a bit weak, so the knight has this beautiful square that it can sit on. But on the other hand, black has a lot of space on the queen side. h3 is played so that the knight doesn't come here and hassle the pawn on f2. In general, a useful move to play. And now a good move is knight to a5, but Magnus makes a slight error with queen e7. Now bishop d5 would be very strong, because if the knight takes, then pawn takes opens up the rook's attack on the e5 pawn. But Duda plays a5, not bishop d5. And what he's planning to do is fix this weakness on a6 and attack it. Meanwhile, this a5 pawn can also become a big weakness later on in the game. We'll see which pawn becomes the bigger of the two weaknesses. h6, a useful move also made by Magnus, just improving his position, stopping any white piece from going to g5. Queen comes up, and now the bishops are offered to trade. Black seems to have equalized out of the opening. The rook is coming to the d file, and so right now bishop, takes with the queen. And now how should white continue here? Should play the queen on c4? No, he goes knight b3. Very interesting move, because what Duda wants is this c5 square for his knight. So when the bishop goes back, he trades the bishop in order to get this c5 square, which is an important square for the knight, because it will not only attack the queen but also the pawn here on a6. But Magnus is okay. He plays rook f to d8. The position is very, very interesting from the perspective of weaknesses. c5 is a weak square. Black queen can also come to c4. a5 pawn, a6 pawn, all these pawns are a bit weak. So a lot of things to play for. Both players also having quite a bit of time. Duda has 2 minutes on the clock. Magnus has 2 minutes 28 seconds. What is Duda calculating here? One of the things he might be calculating is the natural move to go knight c5. Because if Magnus comes queen c4 now, he can push the queen away with b3, and then the queen goes to b5. It's an important move to put the queen there. But no, Duda doesn't go for these lines. He goes queen e2. Now with this move, what he's telling Magnus is that I'm going knight c5. You won't have the c4 square. And then I will also attack the a6 pawn twice. So very interesting move here played by Duda. But Magnus now plays a beautiful move, knight h5. He's coming in with his knight. He's going to attack the queen. You can't play g3 to stop it because the h3 pawn is hanging. So Duda goes knight c5. And he's expecting Magnus to move his queen, but Magnus moves in with his knight. Whoa! This is attack for an attack there. Now the queen taken, then I'll take your queen. So he takes on e6, takes on e2 with a check. If you take rook e2, after fe6, black has the open file here. So Duda doesn't want to really take the knight on e2. The other option then is to come king f1, but Magnus is there with knight g3 to double white pawns, and now black's pawns are also doubled. So once again, we have a lot of imbalances in the position. Black's pawns are doubled, but so are white's. e4 pawn is isolated. This pawn on a5 now suddenly starts to become more weak than the a6 pawn, because the knights are differently placed. White's knight is not doing much, while the black knight is attacking there. Also rook b8 to b5 becomes a big plan. The time on the clock, 48 seconds for Duda, 2 minutes 11 seconds for Magnus. The king comes up to f7. What is Duda going to do next now? Because the more pieces he trades, the more difficult it might be for him to defend the a5 pawn. The e5 pawn, on the other hand, can be defended by the king. So this endgame has suddenly become quite dangerous. Magnus now chops off the rook. You take with the rook now, and king e7, just stopping the rook from entering. Now the a5 pawn is hanging. You don't want to go rook a1, but also if knight takes, then there's knight e5. So pawn moves up to g4. Duda thinks his position is fine, but look at the time on the clock, and look at Magnus's idea. He wants to go rook p8, defend his own pawn, attack here, a typical maneuver in such positions. The rook really settles down well on the b5 square. Is Duda going to lose the pawn? He goes king e3, which is a useful move to play in general. Magnus brings his rook up, pawn to g5, Magnus takes it, knight takes, and now b3 played. Whoa, what a move there. If you take, I take with a check and then chop off your b2 pawn, because the a5 pawn anyway is falling. You know, Magnus could have also taken the pawn on a5. Now rook c1 played so as to put pressure on the c7 pawn. That is Duda's idea. The position still dynamically equal, but Magnus is putting the pressure. He takes the pawn. Very important for Duda to play c4, but he blunders with knight f3. And now Magnus has knight c4. Look at Duda's time. He has only 4 seconds. He's shaking his head. He's down to 2 seconds. King e2 played. It's like Duda has almost given up. Pawn takes pawn, rook takes, and now rook takes b2. You will see that black is 2 pawns up, but white gets back one of the pawns. So it's 3 versus 4 in knight endgame, and generally that's good enough for the side with the extra pawn to win in knight endgames. Also, notice this a pawn is such a strong passer. Magnus also has 1 minute 45 seconds. Duda shaking his head. He's unhappy with the way he has played. But Duda is a fighter, and you can see that he's kind of refreshed himself and said to himself, I need to just fight. I just need to give my best, and I must make Magnus's task as difficult as possible. That's what he's doing. And now king e3. If knight d7, you can actually take here, Duda. But of course, you can't calculate it all in that less time. That pawn endgame surprisingly is a draw. Now Magnus pushes his pawn. It's still equal because white's pieces and pawns are very well placed, while black's pieces and pawns are not so easy to advance. King goes to f3, knight comes out. You can see that Magnus is going to use his amazing endgame technique to put pressure on Duda. He first is bringing his knight to a better square. He brings it to f4 so that the knight could come to g2 and attack this pawn. Duda has thwarted that plan with king f3. He has 7 seconds on the clock. It's amazing how Duda is maintaining his time on the clock. Now the knight comes and blocks the pawn. Magnus is trying to bring his knight into the game. The knight goes to b4. If there's some way in which Magnus can dislodge the knight from c4 square in order to promote his own pawns, but it's not going to be easy. He goes knight c2 check, and now brings his knight to the center of the board. Duda moves in. Ooh, the c5 pawn is hanging. You can't save it with the king. It's a check there. So what to do? Are you losing the pawn? If you go knight b3, then all of a sudden the king comes in. That's also a trouble. So he goes knight f3, he goes after another pawn, check, and now Duda is going to actually win. The pawn on a6, for a second he'll be a pawn up from being pawn down, but now Magnus has restored the material balance, and this should be an easy draw now. The only problem, of course, is that the knight is going in and attacking this pawn. Duda plays his knight to b8, maybe not the best idea, and now knight c5 will trap the knight, so he brings his knight back with 1 second on the clock. Magnus has won the pawn, but still the position is drawn. It's not easy to win, but from a completely even position, Duda has made a mistake which has given Magnus a chance. He brings his king on the other side. You can see the concentration on Magnus's face. Duda, meanwhile, still on 5 seconds. How is he managing to keep his nerves with so many moves to make? King comes up to f6, and Duda is not so happy. But guys, do you know this position is actually a draw? Knight d4, but not when you have just 2 seconds. That's so difficult to make all the accurate moves, but he's doing it. The Polish Grandmaster is making one good move after another, and the knight is coming to d5, not only to check but also to prevent the king from coming to the f4 square. How is Magnus going to continue next? Pushing the pawn might not be a good idea, so he keeps his knight there. Knight comes to d6, the king defends it, and now black puts his knight on f7. White is playing quickly. Look at Duda's time now, 7 seconds. Magnus down to 38 seconds. Insane. king g5. He's improving the position of the king. Knight comes to d6, attacking the e4 pawn with a check. Duda down to 4 seconds. He needs to move. He plays his king there, but Magnus moves his king in. Now important to come back to d3. He makes a mistake with knight d7. And now Magnus is winning. Knight f7, brilliant move. Knight f6, another important move. Don't push g5. There is knight g4 with a draw. So you need to play king h3. He finds it again. What a beautiful move. King goes back. And now it's time to start pushing your pawn. That's exactly what he does. Duda is shaking his head. He knows that he's now messed it up. He's actually going to lose his another pawn. Magnus is back. He there feels the relief of, the way in which he was better, and then the things turned around. Duda fighting. But now, for sure, black is winning with these 2 pawns, and Magnus being very careful. Duda resigns. What a game that was between these 2 players.